Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming along. We've got a treat for you today, a stacked lineup on this panel. We're going to be talking about how to choose a chain. So just to cue up the subject, the blockchain space over the past few years has seen a lot of investment at the infrastructure layer, which has resulted in a myriad of chains for builders and founders to choose from. Be that alt layer 1s, layer 2s, layer 3s, monolithic chains, modular chains, app chains, the list goes on. This can be a confusing and a bit daunting space for even a seasoned Web3 professional, let alone a new founder entering the space. So what we want to do with this panel is just really get down to the brass tacks of what should founders and builders be thinking about when choosing a chain. And we want people to walk away with actionable and insightful advice. So joining us today on the panel, we've got Ryan Wyatt, who's the Chief Growth Officer at Optimism and Venture Partner for BITKRAFT. We have Chris Zhu, who is the CEO of Sonic SVM, a gaming-focused Solana Layer 2. And we have Andrew Soro, who is VP of Sales and Business Development at Immutable. My name is Ben, I'm moderator, and today I'm the Web3 analyst on the crypto team at BITKRAFT. So before we dive into the first questions, I'd love for you guys to just spend like 1 or 2 minutes to just give a high-level overview of what each of your respective companies are building. Ryan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I work at Optimism. Optimism has a L2, but also has a blockchain software stack called OP Stack that some of the large companies like Coinbase use for their L2 base. The goal is by having OP Stack, a lot of these networks can be interoperable. One of the big things that we've seen in the industry is fragmentation across blockchains, and so OP Stack aims to alleviate that issue by everyone being on the same shared standard.
That's a good elevator pitch. Awesome. So Immutable, we started building games about 7 years ago. Today we're the leading Web3 gaming platform, all-in-one solution ultimately. So we have a chain built on Polygon, so the Immutable zkVM, 400 or so games building on the platform, and really the objective is how can we simplify the experience for game developers, remove all the decision criteria, and make it really easy for them to focus on what they ultimately do best, which is ship amazing games.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Zhu. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Sonic SVM. Sonic is the first gaming-focused SVM on top of Solana. And on the back end of that, we built our own scaling solution called Hypergrid, which allows us to issue and launch additional Solana virtual machines focused on different verticals as well as scalability configurations. We started doing this around 3 years ago, helping games go to market within Web3 and just landing in Solana for its liquidity as well as community. Can share more in the later panels.
Thank you, gentlemen. So first question I'll throw to you, Ryan. The FAT protocol thesis posits that in blockchain networks, value primarily accrues at the protocol level, with generally applications built on top capturing less. As I mentioned, given the proliferation of block space over the past few years, coupled with advances in chain abstraction, such as the stuff that you're building with the shared sequencer layer, this stuff eases the flow of liquidity in users between chains, and even allows apps to span multiple chains and ecosystems. So my questions are, firstly, does this thesis need updating? Where do you see value accruing in this new world? And secondly, as block space does become more of a commodity, how can ecosystems, such as the ones that you guys represent, differentiate themselves to attract and retain builders?
Yeah, so I think that that thesis is probably like 9 years old, and it was written around the time when Bitcoin was like a $10 billion market cap, and now we're, it's $1 trillion plus, and look at the overall market cap. So in some ways, I think it was very accurate. If you look at the top market caps, they're all obviously blockchain protocols. And yeah, we've been in this infrastructure dilemma for quite some time. Before Optimism, I was at Polygon, and what we continue to still face, all of us do, is it's quite cumbersome, to build on chain. It's quite cumbersome to deploy, to get users. Users bridging assets is a nightmare. We haven't solved some of these to a user would be very rudimentary user journeys that they want to have. And so I think there's a long way to go, and this has been kind of, application developers have really suffered from this because, one, the space isn't big to begin with. Then all of a sudden you have to very narrowly scope it to a blockchain. Then deploy that app And you really are, you're in a tough spot because you're kind of beholden to the users and capital and size of that chain because things like bridging and getting your assets and getting users in is still very difficult. Now, I will say the big change in the last 12 months has been it's really cheap and affordable to spin up a blockchain. That's great. The problem is it really increases fragmentation because anybody can roll up the chain and so forth. And so I think, this is kind of why Optimism went with the decision that it went. Instead of just being the single standalone L2, offer your stack to people that want to use it. And there is some downside because it is a shared standard. So it doesn't afford like a high degree of customization, but what will allow for is interoperability and more seamless interoperability where people don't realize what chain they're on. And I think there's value long-term in that for both the user and the application developer to really abstract away like the underlying blockchain. Like if you go play Call of Duty, you don't give a shit in the multiplayer experience if it's AWS or cloud. It's like that's not what the discussion is. And so I ultimately think we need to get to that place for application developers to start to thrive and then get their piece of the pie. They will inevitably. There just really hasn't been any successful apps on blockchain other than Polymarket, in the game side, Axie Infinity early on. And I think a lot of that is not for a lack of effort or really good ideas or great founders or great startups. I think it was, a lot of these companies were stuck in lackluster infrastructure, which is changing, and it's changing rapidly. And if you look at like Immutable, they're working to like make it really easy and seamless for game developers to deploy. If you look at Base is increasing gas target limits to basically reduce these transaction costs. So wallets are now starting to span across many chains. So I think this is going to be a better experience, and I do think long-term applications will get to capture more value than they've been able to up until this point. I think it's going to take a little bit of time, though.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add, I think, was maybe the second half of your question, just around like where specifically value will accrue. Like gaming, everyone in this room knows, content gaming is very power law driven, and so therefore, when you think of something like an Immutable, for example, obviously Sonic as well, like very, very specific to this space, like. To Ryan's point, yes, there's the ability for, we'll have the generalized infrastructure layer, but I do think that ecosystems like Immutable, for example, will conform to power law. There will be winners, right? People, and specifically game devs, like there's a very specific set of requirements and needs that they have, right? That is maybe not best served all the time by generalized infrastructure. And so I think there will be winners on the one level above the infrastructure layer, just to kind of answer that last point around like, hey, where do you think that the value will accrue? Obviously, there still is a massive win for the infrastructure layer that it's being built on. So I think that's kind of how we think about those things, and it's obviously a really big reason why we set up the Immutable business to be what it is.
Sounds great. Thank you. And Chris, anything you would like to add there?
Yeah, so when we think about value accrual, we also think about it from the game studio's perspective. From an industry perspective, we think that we're in the very early innings when it comes to revenue diversification and how game studios or content businesses think about crypto monetization. So if we break down, gaming types, every single different types of games actually have a different revenue stream, so to speak. And we think that that's similar in crypto as well. And I was talking to Andrew about this, where if we're focusing on NFT marketplaces revenue streams, if you're focusing on DeFi staking yields on top of Solana, where we built, there's a very large focus for the DeFi community and DGen community, and that leads us to really think about the diversification of revenue streams as well when we build a chain. So from a chain level, can you enshrine these protocols within the chain where you're tapping to the liquidity of base layer of Solana validator staked weight, and then building on top of the game, maybe a restaking mechanism that actually allows the game to generate yield off of the staked Solana on the base layer, and tapping into that natively. And we think that as the chain or the gaming environment ourselves, our value accrual has to align with the gaming studios. So if the game is a MMORPG that has a significant traffic volume as well as velocity of money moving between these transactions, then maybe we should just have a share on top of the token swap fees. But if the games have cosmetics or collectibles as the base layer of their revenue generation, then we should share that as an ecosystem of that marketplace fees as well. So we think about our chain itself as a ecosystem that serve the game the best, and then diversify those revenue streams with the games. So we think value accrual happens only when you align with apps that are building on top of.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think now would probably be a good opportunity, actually. I mean, I think a lot of people here will be familiar with what Optimism are doing and what Immutable are building. As a newer entrant to the space, would you like to just maybe go a little bit deeper into like why does Solana itself need a gaming layer 2?
Yeah, so when we started building go-to-market strategies as well as launching assets for games 3 years ago, there wasn't very mature layer 2 solutions or very mature high performance parallel execution environments. So we actually got a look at all of these environments, getting offers from Starkware, Polygon, getting offers from Solana at the same time. And what we realized is that there is a strong focus within the Solana ecosystem when it comes to user experience, usability, as well as just being cheap. And we thought that that was actually a really strong advantage when it comes to the builders on top of the ecosystem. So Sonic, when we started building this SVM environment, it was to solve 3 major problems for Solana specifically. The first one is that it is very, very difficult for digital assets to launch on top of Solana. There's no publishing infrastructure. There are no teams like Immutable helping games go to market. And if you look at all of the chains within the EVM ecosystem that are building for gaming specifically, you have Immutable, BMX, Ancient, 8, such and so forth. All of those together adds up to tens of 20s of billion dollar market caps, or FDVs. On Solana, the whole gaming ecosystem, their market cap added up together is less than a fraction of those total numbers. I don't have the exact numbers now. So when that number is being compared, we think that when you have a up-and-coming ecosystem like Solana, the liquidity is rising so rapidly, the gaming studios would naturally want to migrate or think about an ecosystem that they can launch with such high growth of liquidity. The second problem is that it is very difficult for each individual game to avoid hotspots on Solana or on Ethereum as well. So on Ethereum, you actually doesn't have local fee markets like Solana, where one game's fee spikes will not affect the other game's fee spikes. But on Solana, there's congestion issues that happen in March or April. So we're here to solve that as well. And then the third is just how do you support games as a whole ecosystem of tools, giving gaming-specific DEXs, gaming-specific marketplaces, all of the matching infrastructure. And that's what Sonic enshrines into its protocol, so that on the contract level, when you sign with a chain, you think about the revenue shares with that chain already. So those 3 problems are what Sonic basically offers to solve.
Thank you very much. So Andrew, I'd like to direct the next one at you, and then I'd love to hear the other 2 chip in as well. But the EVM clearly has network effects today around developers, tooling, infrastructure. How should founders think about VM diversity in the future? Like, there's obviously other VMs are gaining traction now, most notably the SVM, and then there's the Move VM as well. Do you think that in the future we will see developer mindshare split evenly across different VMs, or do you think there will be a Powell law type distribution? I'd love to hear your thoughts there, and then Chris, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well as someone who's building in the SVM space.
Yeah, good question. I think maybe starting at the back end, I think yes, it might start with Power Law, but I think at the end of the day, very, very similarly to I don't know, when you're playing Call of Duty, I don't know if you're super worried if it's Google, hosting it, or Amazon on the back end. Ultimately, I think for developers, when we speak to developers, the single biggest thing is hey, trying to understand their objectives and what ecosystem today. And I think it's pretty clear. Pretty early on in this space, and obviously a lot of builders here, and other than Axie, we haven't had that really another hit that truly is very undeniable, and we can then go and say, hey, look, these Web2 studios are coming into the space. And so I think it's really about what are the specific challenges and problems that these developers are running into, and so how does the ecosystem help them support that? So on the Immutable side, there's a couple different things. Of course, Passport, that's our wallet product, which is kind of invisible transactions, really easy sign-in. And then there's a ton of services, right? So we started by building games. We understand some of the challenges that people run into, and so at the end of the day, it's like, hey, how do you get a token to market? How do you think about tokenomics? How do you think about the economy? And so I think it's really about choosing the developer, or sorry, rather the platform and the ecosystem that you think is really going to help you achieve your objectives. And then I think at the end of the day, like, we're not zero sum. We like to be positive sum. I think a win for Immutable is a win for everyone, and I think a win for Sonic or an Optimism is a win for everyone as well. So if there's a huge win elsewhere, I think rising tides lift all boats.
We're obviously all in on EVM. You know, like, we really do want to be an extension of Ethereum, like, not be shy about it, much like, you know, Sonic would be about Solana. I think Move is really interesting from a language, but if you just, like, look from a game developer's perspective, it's already so hard to make a game. Like, you just start with that. Forget if it's a blockchain game, like, fuck it. It's just hard to make a game that's really expensive. You have to then have a go-to-market strategy that attracts users. You need those users to play that game. You need those users to stay in the game and come back and retain. So then, like, you're like, okay, that's already hard. I got to go do that. Now I'm going to go do it in the blockchain world. I have to pick one of these protocols that I want to deploy from. And so you are really, like, handcuffed when you start to move outside of EVM on that decision that you're making there, which could be good or bad. You might get a big grant to do it, but you're handcuffed. Whether it works or not, you are. Long term, maybe that's not the case, but right now, I just personally would err on the side of, like, where is their composability? Where can you hedge your bets a little bit? You know, if a chain didn't work for you, what would the migration look like to be on another chain? You know, it's like, oh, I launched on, you know, this specific chain, at least it's EVM, I can be able to migrate to Base really easily if that's something that makes sense for me because they're, you know, they're leading or they're doing marketing for us. So that's the tough part that I see right now. Like, it takes so much to build these ecosystems up. And when I look at the space, I look at, like, Ethereum and Solana are the only two that have, like, done that, where they can stand very confidently in their ecosystems and say, there's capital here, there's real users here, there's real developer enthusiasm here. It's just really hard for me to move outside of those two ecosystems. Like, I'm bullish as hell on both of them. It just, not that I'm not, like, excited and eager on some of those, it's just, they're later to the entrance. It's going to take more time for these to develop community and develop users and, you know, build that kind of foundation that makes developers confident to deploy. And really, in the interim, it's just going to be developers that are going to get huge grants to deploy there to subsidize the risk by deploying there. And that's okay. Like, that's how you start. Like, that's what, you know, that's what I would do if I was leading, like, something on the Move side. That's the right strategy. You just put yourself in a precarious situation in an environment that's already difficult to thrive in.
Chris, what would your response be there?
I think it's very comforting to hear, you know, the Optimism Foundation be bullish on Solana as well. So if you look at top 3 or top 5 tokens, right, you have USDC and the USDT. You take those away, you have, you know, Ethereum, Solana, and then obviously Bitcoin on top of charts. So I think the asset allocation when it comes to liquidity perspective is already figured into that small subset. TON obviously is a different particular use case, but a little bit off of the topic here. Now that we've established Ethereum and Solana being, you know, top of choice there, we actually think that VM differences actually don't matter as much. We just look at, 1, where are the retail users, and 2, what are the support pillars for games, and then obviously 3, how much liquidity you have as a total pool so that the users actually have access to those liquidity. And when we look at retail users, obviously EVM all combined together is a huge ecosystem. I think Solana is a little bit different where, because of the emphasis on use case, Ethereum almost as a nation state or, you know, a network state actually had multiple L2s or multiple segregation of these rollups first, and then they cared about use case afterwards. Whereas Solana started with use case so that every single one of these rollups or network extensions, now that we call them, actually starts off with a validated use case. So you make sure that each one of those network extensions actually are proliferated with users first and foremost. And that's why the foundation has been the Solana Foundation has been so carefully selecting the network extensions that they, you know, push for and allow, and gaming is obviously one big part of that. And now that we look at liquidity, I think that's something that's already been validated with the current market sentiment around Solana. And then the third is that we think that VM itself actually doesn't matter as much because really, at the end of the day, there's a clear trend towards block space being commoditized, meaning that your gas fees are going to go lower, your chain's going to go faster, and all of the new chains, they all have this, you know, same sentiment, right? Whether it be building Mega ETH on top of Ethereum, building Monad on the side, and then you all have the similar structure where you're commoditizing block space. And if you even consider gas fee as a revenue stream, I think it's ultimately, at the end of the day, not so wise. Optimism has an amazing business model with sequencer overestimating the fees, so you can always generate revenue off of those. When you decentralize that, I don't know, but I think that's such an amazing and elegant business model there. And then the last is like, what are the differences between the VMs? We actually think that market or the token price actions is something that make or break an ecosystem. And really, if you think about all of the existing tokens out there that have gone through a trough to top and then back to trough, Ethereum and Solana are the only two, with Solana's being 0.2 to 260 and then back to 8 and then now 150. That is the biggest kind of fluctuation you can hand make with someone taking the fall for it. So we think that as a developer, you should also think about the community reaction to those type of fluctuations of volatility, and it's very rare to have one at that massive scale. So I think the new ones are really, you can probably squeeze out like 1 or 2 million or 3 million of grants, but is that enough for you to make a world-changing game? And I think that's not.
Anything either of you two would like to add to that, or?
No, I mean, not really. I agree. I think like block space is totally getting commoditized. I mean, our team actually worked on 4844 and some of the things with blobs, and we're increasing gas targets and limits on base. Like, we really want to drive these transaction costs down too. So I think that's right. I agree on directionally where things are going in the space.
Maybe like just to be a tiny bit contrarian, it wouldn't be a panel without that. Do it. I think for the game developer, like sometimes it also just depends on like what's your project, like what are you trying to achieve. So Chris and I were talking about this earlier today. Actually, like I think what they are set up to do very well and very elegantly is like right now on Solana, there's obviously like Solana is unabashedly very much like, hey, there's a very giant casino retail element to that, right? And the community really leans into that. So if your game is really going to try to take advantage of that, and base is actually another great example of that. So like, sure, like at the end of the day, like VMs obviously choose some of the leading ones and don't go out for like number 3, 4, 5 that maybe won't be around. But I think what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to tap into degen liquidity? Or are you trying to tap into like meme coins? I think there's a very clear choice for where to deploy based off of that. Some of the projects that Immutable speaks to, if you think of like how crypto's used more around ownership, hey, we're going to get them in with a bit of a gameplay loop, and then oh, by the way, kind of D1, D3, whenever it is, Passport flashes up. They don't even know that they kind of provisioned a wallet, and then it's kind of ownership, and so just kind of different rails. I think it is a little bit project dependent, and so that's probably where I'd be like, hey, like really have a think about what the project is specifically trying to achieve, and those are some of the conversations that we have with developers. Maybe not super contrarian now that I said that.
So just build on the super chain, build on base.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess Web3 game developers today, or Web3 developers in general, as a percentage of total developers in the world, is obviously very small today. Clearly, to grow the space, we need to bring more Web2 developers into the fray. What do you guys think are the biggest hurdles? And Ryan looks like he disagrees, so I'd love to hear his thoughts.
I don't know about that, but yeah.
So like, what do you see the biggest hurdles are today in transitioning Web2 developers into the Web3 space, and what can ecosystems like yourselves help?
I actually don't know that I subscribe to the idea of like bringing Web2 developers into Web3 at all, to be honest with you. Not that you can't. I'm just like not super hopeful about it. I think ultimately, when I spend a lot of time talking to Web2 developers and you ask them, like, well, why do you want to build on chain? They have, like, really shitty or non-existent answers. And, like, right there is, like, a good reason of why you shouldn't do it, right? I think if blockchain games, Web3 games, crypto games, whatever the fuck you want to call them, you really have to come at it with, like, a whole different perspective in why you're doing it. What's the rationale? And, like, the games that are going to inevitably, and they will break through. I know we haven't really had any breakthrough games. I do fully believe we will. I am like 100% certain they're not going to come from Web2 native developers unless they have like completely been red-pilled and they have thought about this differently. Like form-fitting a Web2 game and be like, oh, you want to put like your digital assets or like your digital items on chain? That's like so cool. Why? Like there's so many ways you can do that today. So there's got to be something more there. There's got to be something bigger. And so I think it's going to come from like the native Web3 cohort, and that's where they might create inspiration for Web 2 developers inevitably. Like I think about, mobile games and how that really broke, a lot of stigma around the genre and category. Free to play, coming from Asia to the West with like Riot and League of Legends. Like there are people that hate these models and then adopt them. I think that could happen long term with like Web 2 developers where they start to incorporate it. But that first inflection point, the first people through the wall are going to be native Web 3 developers.
Maybe. I agree with you mostly. And I think like just actually one of the things that Immutable is doing strategy-wise, I agree with you probably like 75%. I don't think that the like innovation, like really an indie dev, and I truly believe this, is going to have obviously so much more license and creativity to just really kind of push the boundaries and experiment. And that's where a lot, the incumbents usually aren't the ones that are pushing. I do think though there is something to be said about, so at Immutable, one of the things that we're doing is we're actually going and very programmatically approaching specific Web 2, and I don't like using Web 2 or Web 3. We're approaching very large gaming businesses, taking a look at their catalog, but those businesses already have to have someone, to Ryan's point, that is red-pilled and is willing to stand up in the organization and go, hey, I've already wanted to do this, but they might need the extra nudge. They might need a partner to help them kind of go on that journey. And then there's probably other different support that they would ultimately need. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're being very, very selective about who we're going to. We're going to have a couple announcements coming up shortly, just partnering with large studios. Because I do think, like, while maybe some of the innovation and the moonshots aren't going to come, I do think that there is something really valuable about having those like lighthouse beacon developers that are building in the space, but it has to be credibly. It can't just be like, hey, here you go, here's like a Web 2 game, we're just going to slap this on. It's got to be very thoughtful, and it has to be led by someone within the organization that is thinking completely differently and has the license to basically think completely differently. So slightly different take.
Good luck marketing to the gamers of like that IP. That's the other thing too. It's like
yep,
like
sure.
The AAAs and those type have like cultivated, and they are all like very anti-loot, anti-NFT, anti-on-chain already. And so that's why it's like you need this group of users and developers that fucking live and breathe this and like totally get it. And even if that's small, it's like build that. But I would love to be wrong. It'd be sick. It would accelerate like adoption of Web3 games if this did happen and I was wrong.
Yeah. So on that point, I actually think Immutable has a couple of games that we personally really like. Space Nation, for example, MMORPG, great Web 2 studio, one of the legendary producers across the board, coming into Web 3 and actually brought a lot of the old EVE Online users with them with their guild model and the on-chain economy as well. So I think the question that we always ask is like, do you love the metagame? To the producer as well as the retail users, do you like the trading aspect of all of this on-chain economy and actually having an open system where you can market and trade all of these assets? And for Space Nation, for example, I think the answer was like a clear yes. Obviously, we also want to get them on Solana as well eventually, but and once you have that, like the love of the metagame, then you can I actually think that having a Web 2 experience of building games is such a big plus. Yeah. Fast forwards it.
Yeah, like we have CCP that's in the Optimism ecosystem, right? eFrontier, which is on Redstone, which is an OP stack chain. That's a great example of like Web 2 developers that went like full in red pill. Yeah, and then used all that expertise and like fucking crushed it, right? So they're there, but like you need that, right?
But that's my point. It's very rare, and like this is not like a spray and pray approach. It will not be successful if you go to Web 2 businesses and say, take game and like just let's slap on blockchain. Like I think that's 1.0 vintage of what has been tried in this space. So I think you have to be like really, really selective about it.
Yeah, just trade first.
Excellent.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if there's any burning questions, we have time for like maybe one question. If not, we'll call it a day. Go, Matt.
So you just had a really good discussion about sort of the high-end AAA traditional game developers. But if you're taking more of a Web3 native approach, how would you go about reaching out to like the grassroots that might be more open to building on any of it?
From like a developer's perspective?
From like, I guess so. You guys are all kind of in a BD type role as well.
Yeah.
How are you reaching these people? How are you pitching them? Are they coming to you? Just like sort of cold deal flow? Like how does that look for you?
Yeah, I mean, you two would probably be better off to answer. Like on the Optimism side, we're focused on chains, like deploying chains. So like we're spending time with a lot of the big organizations that want their own blockchains. But we have a large grant program that has, it's called retro funding, is 800 million OP tokens. And any chain that's built on OP Stack can pull from that. So I don't know, as like a developer, I look at like where are you going to get the kind of go-to-market, where are you going to get funding support, as still very critical. Like I think that's an important part. But yeah, you guys might be better off on the individual.
Ryan, master of chains.
Master of chains, yes.
Yeah, so I think at Immutable we made a decision really early on. So like, of course, like so I run the BD team. I was the first commercial hire 3.5 years ago. It was very clear. Yes, we had some inbound. That was also at the peak of the peak of peak. Like this was right after NBA Top Shots, and then the inbound dried up, and it was like very clear. And there's actually only so many devs that are red-pilled and are building in Web3. And so for us, it was very clear that we actually had to build like a very programmatic, thoughtful kind of go-to-market engine. And so like my BD team is everywhere. Like I'm based in Sydney. No one is in Sydney. My team is where customers are. So one, like we're just like have the conversations, like stay in touch. Like a game developer is obviously, there's such a long lead cycle. And we typically find about 6 months before launch is like when it starts to get critical. We actually would like to engage much more earlier and have you think about, specifically what the stack is going to look like. But 6 months is the critical part. But yeah, I don't think it's rocket science. I do think that there's plenty of examples of BD in the space and just like, hey, we're gonna like go do announcements, pump token, whatever. Like for us, it's very much about like, what are you building? Like how can we sit alongside you, like understand your challenges, problems, and how does Immutable solve that with both tech, services, ecosystem, et cetera? I mean, BD 101.
We think that a mix of both is super interesting, where we have a BD team that actually targets the specific catalog of games that we want to talk to, kind of creating a catalog of, initially maybe we wanted more degen-focused prediction markets, and then later on volume-based DeFi games. So we have targets every week on a review session. On the other hand, there are the grassroots developers that you're talking about. So I see the Dojo shirt there, but Mod and Dojo's documentation structure is actually something that we looked at early on to have that super easy to use and have that user experience or developer experience super easy. And I think Solana's super team is a really interesting structure where they decentralize the community, operations community, where they pick a localized operational manager for each one of these countries that want to spin up a super team that's already a holder of their token. So in this case, a Stark token could be interesting. And then they select that person and let that person run the entire nation's operations, and then they give grant based on what they call nation GDP. So basically, the total amount of money generated from Vietnam or France or whatever place that super team is spun out, and then they gauge the metrics of these individual places by the number of submissions of hackathons. So now you have a documentation, you have grant structure, all based on number of submissions for hackathons, and you have grassroots developers. And Mud, I think, or Lattice did a really interesting thing where they just got the best developers, CCP, for example, write essays. Right? That's a thing that's low touch for these developers. Just write an essay, put up a booklet called Autonomous World Research, and then you have an entire group of people that are super interested in this ideology. And I thought that was really cool as well.
Well, thank you very much, gents. It's been a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.